on the threat to media freedom in Europe. How can it be protected? Our program today is supported by the European Media and Information Fund. I'm Brian Maguire. Welcome. You can comment on our social media using the hashtag EA Debates, and you can post your questions on Slido on the side of the screen using the hashtag Media Freedom. You can scan the QR code, you can see right there as well. We'll be taking questions throughout the discussion, not just at the end. So you can start now, send your questions, and we'll put those to the panel a little bit into the discussion as well. Thank you for joining us today. So free and independent media is a key pillar of democracy, but recently worrying trends have emerged across Europe. In response, the EU introduced a new legal instrument, the European Media Freedom Act, which lays down safeguards for editorial independence of media and facilitates media operations in the EU. The rules address in member states issues such as lack of safeguards for independence of public service media, lack of media ownership transparency, unfair removal of content of media service providers on large online platforms. It also aims to tackle fragmented national rules on the assessment of media market concentrations and unfair allocation of state advertising. The rules will principally enter into force next year in August 2025. In addition, the F.R.E.I.H.E.I.T project, which stands for Fact-Checking and Reliable European Information to Help Europe Integrate Together, aims to address foreign interference in European media. So joining us to discuss this, we have an expert panel today with Sofia Kartunen, Legal Officer, Audiovisual and Media Services Policy at DG Connect, the European Commission. Very welcome. Sergei Lagodinsky is a member of the European Parliament and Chair of the Delegation to Euronest. Paolo Gori, Secretary General Coordinator of the European Digital Media Observatory, and Katie Soshashvili is a journalist from the F.R.E.I.H.E.I.T project as well. Great to see all of you with us today. Thank you for taking the time to be here. We really appreciate that. I'm going to ask each of you for a 60-second snapshot of your key message for today, and then we'll get into the discussion as well. Sophia, you want to kick off? So your 60 seconds.
Thank you, Brian. And hi, everyone. I'm Sofia Kartunen from DG Connect, the European Commission, working in the I1 unit responsible for the European Media Freedom Act, now already introduced at the beginning of this session. This act is a major flagship initiative of the Commission, now adopted earlier this year and becoming applicable principally next year, as mentioned in the beginning. We hope that with this act, there will be some clear changes in the member states, improving the media freedom and pluralism and editorial independence of the media, possibly also tripping effects in countries outside of the European Union.
Thank you, Sophia. Sergey, 60 seconds.
If anything, I would probably say that the learning process in this area has to go both ways. The threats to media freedom nowadays are so multifaceted and have so many shadings that it's not just about us Europeans teaching our neighbors how to do it better. It's also learning from them, especially in the area of disinformation, but also in many other areas. I think we have long been boasting being the best and the most democratic. Now we have to do our homeworks, and on that, I hope we can also learn from our neighborhood.
So thank you, Paolo.
Thank you very much for this big challenge, 60 seconds. So I would say that democracy depends and starts with information, because we all have the right to make informed decisions. And this cannot go without a healthy information environment. This means media freedom, media pluralism, safety of journalists, but also finding a way to deal with disinformation while at the same time respecting fundamental rights.
Thank you, Paolo. Katie.
Well, thank you so much for having me here with this distinguished guests. I'm coming into the conversation from the EU membership candidate country, Georgia, which is now struggling with its democracy and European future. And the cornerstone of Georgia's democracy is indeed media freedom, something that is at stake along with democracy overall in the country. Journalists now in Georgia are not feeling safe. They are under major threat. That's why they are standing with the protesters in the heart of Tbilisi right now to make sure that this country can have a future that can be called democratic free, where journalists can do their job without threats coming from government parties or other groups that are threatening their freedom to do their job.
Katie, thank you. Let's set the stand out a little bit before we get into the detail. But what do we mean by media freedom? And Katie, who does this well? Who in Europe, within the European Union, does media freedom well?
Who does the media freedom well? I can only speak from the kindred country. I mean, yet we assume that we're. It's basically our status is frozen right now. But from what we look at from this country as a European Union, we think that media freedom in the countries like what we seek to become a part of are protected. There are institutions. More core point in our vision is that there are institutions within the European Union countries that we can rely on to protect the rights of the journalists and civic society overall. So this is really cornerstone in order to uphold all the principles that the European Union believes in and aims to spread in the countries seeking to become the part of the Union one day.
Thank you. Paula, you do Media Observatory stuff. So tell us, when you're looking for media freedom, what is it you're looking to? Where are the problems, and who does this well? Who are the beacons of media freedom in Europe?
So EdMessage looks at more at disinformation, but we have a project here at the UI which is called Media Pluralism Monitor. I think you're all familiar with it. And as you can see also from the last report, I mean, actually there is a risk for media pluralism and media freedom in way more countries in the EU than what one can expect. And I mean, going back to the definition, I think it's a hard question, but I would say there are some key elements. So we need to have, of course, the possibility for media to work independently, to have editorial independence, to not be no interference for any part, but also the right to work safely. And I think Katie was mentioning that, and I think this is very important. And I think we also have to think of, let's think of Article 11 of the Charter. Media freedom and pluralism comes after our freedom of expression and the right that we have as citizens to get informed. So it is also, if you want, functional to that and completely key for our democracy.
Thank you. Sergey, you responsible for this delegation, Euronest. When you're going to these different countries that you're observing, what do you see in terms of, you speak about learning and teaching here as well. What do these countries like Moldova and others, what can they learn from the European Union? And what do you see in lessons for Europe to learn from them as well?
I think the issues of a journalistic code of conduct is something that I do think that in many countries in the European Union, this is something that is a core of self-understanding of journalists. And from that perspective, I think that this is something where we could reinforce the kind of the spirit. In many of those countries, journalists are fighters. You know, they have to fight for democracy, for their freedoms. Sometimes they have physically to fight for their lives. So we have to be humble also in terms of what we tell them, how we tell them. But I think that a kind of a professional code of conduct is something that has been a kind of a solid foundation, at least in many of our countries. And this is something, and it's not just journalists. I see this the same with judges and, and law enforcement issues. This is something that where we have, I would say, kind of our democracy soft power. And this is something they can learn. But on the other hand, I think that in many cases, Western journalists in turn are now learning. I mean, Western. I'm meaning the West from the Eastern Partnership. Are learning hard way what it means to be in a polarized society, what it means to work in a society where money is becoming important and ownership is becoming important. Something that many journalists in the Eastern Neighborhood has been dealing with their whole life. And how to keep the stamina, how to keep this there under those circumstances. I think that's where we can learn from the heroic experiences of many free media representatives from Eastern Partnership.
So, Sophia, it's interesting, isn't it? It's like for years, Europe has been holding itself up, European Union holding itself up as the pinnacle of media freedom. And now we're in listening mode because the challenges that the East have faced, and I'm reporting from Washington this morning, so there's some challenges here now as well. Those challenges of money, principally, as well, and authoritarian governments, they make it much more difficult for journalists, and this courage that Sergei's just described is something that Western European journalists are going to have to find in abundance over the next few years, perhaps, as well. So from your side, how do you see the shift in discussion within the institutions as well, and in the legislative process?
Well, as already mentioned, Article 11 of the Charter of the Fundamental Rights provides for the freedom and pluralism of the media and respect for it. And also respect for rule of law is one of the founding principles of the European Union and member states that have decided to join the Union. So there is a presumption of all the member states adhering to these standards, and it is a precondition also for being part of the Union. However, we have seen some signs of backsliding and some worrying developments also in the member states in the last years in particular. Although overall the member states are performing quite well in a global scale. For example, the Global Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, when it comes to the top 20 countries from this year's results, 13 were European Union member states. But the situation is different depending on the country we are looking at. And even if in certain member states on paper things may seem fine and maybe issues are not perceived in a serious manner at the moment, it's no guarantee that there will not be any issues in the future. So that's why we have now the Act adopted earlier this year to make sure that problems that maybe have not emerged in some countries will not emerge in the future, and address those issues that we currently perceive in some member states in particular.
Thank you. 13 out of 27 doesn't seem like an amazing ratio. We're talking about media freedom in the European Union in terms of performing well. Paula, we're about to enter a really hot period of a challenge for media freedom with Donald Trump's President-elect Trump's second administration. I hesitate to use the word regime, but administration approaching as well, and the financial dynamics that's going to drive as well, which we'll come to a little bit later on. But your concerns, based on what Sophia has just said, the legislation, the Media Freedom Act, is in place. It'll be formally in place in August 2025, so still some time for preparation. Do you have confidence that the European Union member states will honor what's written there, and that it can actually be enforced if they don't honor it?
Well, I hope so, honestly. I agree with Sophia that that's a way to kind of prevent, or if you want to get prepared. So at least on the media side, there is an infrastructure and a structure that should be put in place, and that could indeed be somehow, if you want, a way to prevent some escalation. But I think there is an important element here, which is the rule of law, which was already mentioned. So whenever countries turn out in a situation in which the whole principle of the rule of law is not respected, unfortunately, we have already seen that, the response at EU level or politically is a little slow. So I really hope that this, in any case, will help us, but I think we will have to seek it then case by case if something happens. I was reading recently, actually, the recent Edelman report, and the trust in media and in journalists is really low. People trust more their CEO than the journalists. So I think we have to go back to what you were saying earlier. We are in a polarized society, and so a lot of the dynamics that are in place go beyond regulation. They are more at societal level.
Katie, this just to dovetail with that, we're dealing with mainstream media, if we want to use that broad term, traditional legacy media, And then we're dealing with online news, which comes from multiple sources and is driven largely through TikTok and other social media platforms as well. How important is the European Media Freedom Act in that context? Are we looking at a smaller, are we trying to enforce standards in an area of media and information, disinformation, which is too small? And do we need to really have a broader approach to this?
Absolutely. The approach has to be very comprehensive, and the emergence of disinformation networks has proven that to be true. The problem that we see in the very countries in the European Union are sometimes coming from the Eastern Neighbourhood, or the narratives that we see that first start somewhere in Georgia, or we hear the same in Moldova or elsewhere. We see that those are reflected in the European Union countries too, because there are networks of exactly those untraditional channels working together to amplify certain narratives that are typically targeted to erode democracy globally. One thing that I really want to highlight, being in the country who is fighting for its democracy right now, is that this fight is global. Nowhere democracy can be taken for granted, and this is why it is so important that those countries in the European Union look at Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, countries that are facing malign influences coming from Russia in different forms and shapes, and in understanding that this hybrid attacks that we're experiencing, even and especially in the disinformation arena, are coming and spreading to the EU countries too. And this is why it's really important to have comprehensive approach to this. Traditional media also, beyond polarizing, it has personal interest, and this is not only a case for Georgia or other countries, but also the outside of the European Union, but also inside the European Union. So the media environment today, as the technology has developed so much, is very different, and the approaches have to be relevant and be step forward in planning our policy and approaches. Not everything sometimes can catch up in the form of policy, and understanding how things develop and how rapidly they develop and in what shapes. This is something that European countries should be considering with the countries like us, for example.
Sergey, you reported on Moldova's recent election, and you commended the people of Moldova for holding an election in the face of foreign interference as well. That foreign interference isn't going to go away, and we know that Russia spends billions in terms of disinformation and misinformation in Europe alone. A quarter of all public discourse in the United States for this election as well is said to be funded by a mixture of Russia, China, and Iran. Do you think the European Union needs to step up and fight back, not just with policy, but with stronger funding to protect free and fair elections like you just observed in Moldova, and broader across the European Union as well, making more robust codes of conduct, training journalists better? How do you assume the future of media will be healthy in Europe and with its neighborhood if we don't do that?
If we don't do that, then we're lost. I mean, then we have to do that. The question is, what's the best way of doing this? I think that it's also, but not just a matter of financing. It's also a matter of structures, and having something like a joint a Stratcom or joint journalistic hubs with our Eastern neighborhood partners together to mitigate those attacks would be important. I do think, and I continue to think this, and this is something I mentioned at the beginning, I mean, let's be honest. It's not like there are journalists and they're clean and everything is great on the one side, and then there are like Martians who are bringing the information from Russia. Well, on the other side, there are also people who call themselves journalists. And the question is, not all of them are propagandists. Some of them do this because they think this is the way of doing, and this is, everything is for sale, or they are under pressure. So a lot of this is also not just the outside issue, but also an issue of internal principles and ethics and structures. And I think it is also important to discuss one more thing: the different role of public media and publicly held media on both sides, and how can we use it in the most productive way. Because it's interesting, one of the differences that I see, and please correct me if I'm wrong, those who are on the other side of the EU border for now, hopefully not too long, is that public media, certain public media and state-held media, like in Azerbaijan, play a very, very problematic, to put it mildly, problematic role. Whereas in the European Union, sometimes these are the islands of the last hope for free, balanced journalism, especially public media, but also state-held media sometimes. How do we deal with that? What can we learn from each other? How can we improve the structures of publicly held media in the countries of Eastern Partnership so that they can play the role that CDF and ARD play in Germany, or for that matter, BBC plays in Great Britain, even if it's not a EU member anymore. So I think ethical, so kind of code of conduct, but also structural things are important. And yes, it is extremely important to provide financial basis for those journalists who otherwise don't have any other choice than to move over to the dark side of the media landscape. So they need another option. And this is where we, European Union, as someone who does have the financial opportunities in this area, could make an offer that they first cannot resist, and then second, maybe it could work for, with a better journalistic consciousness and feeling that they're doing the right thing.
Thank you. Sophia, let's unpack the act a little bit as well. So in the context of what we just heard from Sergei in particular here, what does the act do to help make European journalism more robust in terms of ethics, in terms of structure, in terms of partnerships as well? Because the isolation of individual units within the media landscape as well leads to a weakened overall landscape, I think. What does the act do in terms of giving each of these dynamics, and how do you think those dynamics will unfold over the next few years?
So we have different strands to the act. I can maybe give an overview of some of the main ones here, relevant for the journalists. So firstly, in Article 4, we provide certain safeguards for media service providers, and then incidentally also journalists. For example, with the obligation for member states to ensure that journalistic sources and confidential communications are protected. And here also we have rules against the use of surveillance and spyware, a bit in response to the Pegasus scandals that ravaged Europe a few years ago. And then we also have rules on public service media, as already discussed, asking member states to make sure that the European public service media have adequate and sustainable and predictable financial resources to the extent possible, and also providing for transparent and fair appointment and dismissal procedures for the management of the public service media. We also have rules for media service providers to limited extent to be transparent about their ownership structure for European citizens to know who is behind the media that they consume. With also an obligation for media service providers providing news and current affairs content to take measures to guarantee the editorial decisions independence and freedom within the established editorial line, so as to enable journalists to be able to write more freely, and make sure that where there are any conflicts of interest regarding the provision of news, these must be disclosed. We have also certain rules applying to media service providers that could also incidentally help journalists. Here, primarily, I could mention different provisions like audience measurement rules, making sure that media service providers have better access to audience data so that they can better plan the content that they produce, and with an implication on the advertising revenues. And here this also translates as the economic resources then they have available to give to the workers in-house, and also rules on the unfair allocation of state advertising, where state support may be given in an unnecessary extent to let's say pro-government messages as opposed to more independent views. So here we again try to support more independent reporting by ensuring that the conditions for state advertising are more transparent and fair. And then
let's just focus on that one for a moment. State advertising, Paula. If you're sitting in Hungary and you want to survive as a media business, it's extremely hard to refuse government money. And if you don't comply with the editorial line in countries like Hungary, your level of access and your risk of retribution increase. Was that fair?
Yeah, I think the point here, which I wanted to make indeed earlier, is it's not only about money. So we can support journalists with training, with money and so on, but then it's about their safety, it's about their life, it's about the self-censorship position in which they are put in some countries, in which they would deeply like to continue doing their work. They have the training, they have everything, but in the end they end up censoring themselves because the risks to their life, to the family of their life and so on it's too dangerous. So I think we should think a little beyond money only. Some years ago, I visited, for example, an institution which is called the Maison des Journalistes in France, where they are actually welcoming and journalists that escape from such situations, and they are there in a protected situation, and they continue doing their work from there. And I think these are projects, for example, that can somehow be of support. Then, of course, we know all these stories about the laws against foreign agents. So again, there is an issue that when they then stream from another country, there is still a risk and so on. But I think, my point here is, and this links also a lot to the focus of EDMO, which is disinformation, is that quality journalism and journalism need support, but it cannot be only economic support and not only training, because it's about of physical protection. And I think, Katie, this is also something you were mentioning earlier.
Okay, Sergey, I want to come back to you just on this a little bit as well. So, Tucker Carlson, for example, I asked the head of the European Union's External Action Service some months ago in Washington whether he was prepared to ban Tucker Carlson from broadcasting within Europe. He didn't like the question very much. It was uncomfortable, and he didn't really answer. Is this part of the problem, that European Union is allowing levels of disinformation, Russian disinformation in particular, to saturate all of the channels, whether social media or traditional media, and we politely say, well, we respect your opinion? Are we past respecting the opinions of those who produce lies for profit within the European Union? And you know, I would take issue with some of the elements of just what a journalist is. You know, this is a business, and if there's no money behind it, it's very difficult for people to continue their activities. So following the money is critically important. Do we need to really upskill in terms of pushing back on disinformation and low quality, low grade journalism? Sergey?
But you put two things and two dimensions into one question. I think low quality journalism is not up to state authorities to decide what is high and what is low. And let's be careful about that. Also on disinformation, you know, I was in Kyoto on the internet forum. This is a global internet forum of the UN. There was a parliamentarian track, and one of the points was what to do with disinformation and with with false information online. And there were plenty of journalists from other countries. I know this was an African or Near Eastern. They were very active and screaming into those were legislators actually into microphones saying, "Of course, we should ban misinformation." And who should do this? The state authorities, of course. We're saying people from Algeria. We're saying people from I don't want to call the names. During the COVID times, we had instances in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Hungary, where journalists were put under pressure or banned or even prosecuted over attempts because they were, to the definition of the authorities, spreading disinformation. And in fact, they were criticizing the health system that didn't really make it. So, who defines what disinformation is? We have to be careful in this fight as well. I do think it's right that we in the European Union banned Russia today because this is a clearly structurally a propaganda machinery. But if we go to the level of individual journalists, even if they're Tuckers, like Carlson Tucker, who is going to define, where do we start, where do we end? So from my perspective, it should be a more positive agenda in terms of strengthening the other side. And I know it might be naive on our side. I know I'm the one who said for many years, people in the West, you are naive, you don't see what's going on. But I'm also a vehement supporter of our liberal democracy. And liberal democracy means that we know where the decisions of authorities stop. And this is about quality of journalism, for example. So it's a difficult and a complicated situation, but I do think that regulating DSA and regulating online platforms is, for example, something that is important. Also, with caution, we have in the Media Freedom Act the one thing that within 24 hours, some content can and should be taken off. And I know there was a heated debate also within my group and among journalists. Is this the right way to go? Because the people who were affected by disinformation as victims, they said even 5 hours is enough to destroy our lives. But journalists said, well, this could be used by authorities or by owners like Musk to just take out the information that is not to their liking because they say it's disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
It will always be a balance, but democracy is messy. And we will remain messy. That's because this is how it is in the democracy. So there will not be a silver bullet decision on this. We'll have to do it case by case, very carefully, so that we do not destroy the freedom spaces that we have also online.
Okay, thank you. We're going to come back to that a little bit after. Paula, you wanted to reply to this, and I want to take some questions as well. Paula, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, because this is indeed what EDMO is doing. So I just wanted to give also my 2 cents. So I think here the point is that first, even when it's external disinformation, there are, if you want, proxies internally that help further spreading disinformation. Otherwise, that wouldn't go nowhere. And the more money, the more, of course, also internally there are proxies that help doing that. Now, going to the approach that was already mentioned, this is precisely what we are doing. So the idea here is the famous whole of society approach. So we strengthen societal resilience with media literacy. We support fact-checking whenever it is independent. We invest in research, and this is fundamental. Let me insist a little on this, because if we don't understand fully the problem, we cannot tackle it. Without research, we cannot understand it. It's like when you go to the doctor has the knowledge to understand which is the problem and then come with the right solution. And without data access, we will never have the proper understanding of the phenomenon. DSA is coming with that, but we're still not there. And so I think this is important. And I want also to underline how much it is important to create societal resilience with media literacy, but we cannot give the burden only to citizens. So again, this is also another point. Article 18, which was already mentioned now, of the media exemption, there was a long debate, and the idea there is of the debate was not only what was already mentioned, but also the fact that this information is unfortunately shared also on traditional media. So the whole discussion there was, if we give an exemption to the media, we give them the right to continue spreading this information whenever they are spreading, of course, this information. I think that the solution now of Article 18 is quite balanced, because it's not just an exemption, but you have to be registered, you have to be transparent, and so on. And in any case, it applies to content which is against the terms and conditions of the platforms, while the articles of the DSA 28, 35, and 36, so the systemic risks, minors, and so on, they're out of this provision. So I think there is a quite balanced provision. And finally, I will conclude with that. I think let's say that the added value of the DSA is that there is regulation on the platforms, on how the platform work, but not on content. And this is fundamental to, as it was said right now, to maintain the liberal fundamental rights framework that we have in the EU. So, and I conclude just to say that it's a matter of checking on a yearly level if the way the platforms work can actually be exploited by benign actors to spread disinformation and so on, but it doesn't go on the content. And this is very important, and I will conclude with this. We have a right to lie in the EU. As long as it is not going to illegal content, which is another thing, we still have a right to lie, and we shouldn't delete everything just because it's a lie.
Okay, just to finally on this, does it concern you that you see members of the future Trump administration arguing that if you interfere with Elon Musk's platforms, NATO is at risk? Paula?
Yeah, I mean, it concerns me because it's a political concern, you know. I mean, it's really using regulation to it's diplomacy, basically. So it even goes beyond the whole system that we have right now. And unfortunately, I think this was something that we could see, I mean, coming. Honestly, I mean, the moment that Musk started supporting Trump, this is something that would have been expected. Let's see if actually the US really gives so much power to Musk that they actually withdraw from NATO just because of EU regulation on his platform. This is something that I honestly don't know if they're just bluffing right now.
Okay, let's take some questions. And okay, we're going to go do some quick fire questions, then we'll do a couple more in detail. And so let's start. How to protect, this is from Klaus Prompes. How to protect Europe against the Trumpification, for example, alternative facts. Katie, quick answer on that. How do we protect Europe against the Trumpification of alternative facts?
I think I'm not really the one should be answering this, but I can only speak on behalf of the Eastern Partnership countries, and I would ask the person who asked the question, what to determine what do they mean by Trumpification exactly. Okay. But what I can really attest is that Russian influence here is a really big problem and something that kind of brings alarms to this process.
Okay, we're sticking with our American theme here for a second. Sergey, Georgina Turner asks, is the American leadership's use of media comms terrifying or manageable? Is it a threat to EU media freedom?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but media freedom, the threat to media freedom, I think, is a transformation, the general transformation of our media space and digital space. I think also commercialization of our media space to the extreme that we're witnessing. And also the fact that a lot of online platforms are becoming news agencies. And this is a huge problem. If TikTok is a news agency for a whole generation, it's a huge power that we have concentrated in Peking in a way that we didn't even, we don't even talk about them as a media, but they are perceived like this. And the same with X, and the same with many other media platforms. And if we see that those are concentrated either in the United States or in China, and we don't have anything like that, that is a problem. And that's where we have to work on kind of fortifying and making more clear where do we stand, also as controllers, as owners of shares of this media space, and how can we promote our values through that. And so that's kind of a positive agenda where we should be working on, maybe not having our own platform, but having a number of platforms which deserves a space within this pie of
Okay.
information.
Thank you. Okay, from Anne Sophie, and this one is for Paula, and also we'll take this for Sophia as well. So the question is, what are the most commonly consumed sources of Europe for Europeans to obtain news and information? And could some preferences impact the effectiveness of traditional media regulation, like the European Media Act? Sophia, you want to take that first? So what are the most commonly consumed sources of for Europeans to obtain news and information? And could some preferences impact the effectiveness of traditional media regulations and the European Media Freedom Act?
Well, still according to the latest figures I've seen, for example, by the European Audiovisual Observatory, traditional legacy media such as TV and radio, they are still holding strong in the European consumption patterns. However, there starts to be a shift a bit between the older and younger generations, and social media is gaining ground in being more and more used to access news among Europeans. And for this reason, we cannot now consider any new piece of European legislation on media without considering the online element, such as now in the case of the European Media Freedom Act, and also with other pieces of legislation such as the Digital Services Act.
Okay, thank you. Paula.
Sofia said it all. Maybe just to add a few other elements of consideration. One is the fact that we also have to distinguish between active and passive citizens, in the sense that there are lots of citizens that, if you want, actively look for information, and others that consume it passively, both online and on traditional media. Think of, for example, Mediterranean countries in which TV is switched on almost the whole day, and they watch the news during, for example, dinner. So an 18-year-old would tell you, I watch the news on TV because it's a family tradition, but actually they don't really listen to the news. So we have to be careful with those data. And also a quite important to draw the line between rural areas and cities. So in rural areas, the dimensions are usually quite different compared to cities. There where there is more broadband penetration, there is more online, of course, and there is also more, if you want, community feeling online, while in rural areas the situation is often quite different and more related to traditional media, and important to local media that are also part of the whole debate.
Thank you. Sergey, let's go to media literacy a little bit as well. If we use the analogy of food and what we consume around our dinner tables as well, if you teach kids to eat well, and even if their parents' habits are not great, over a generation, you're likely to improve the overall health of the nation. Is the same true for media? Can we instill media literacy standards within the younger generation that over time will mean that our media consumption is healthier and our ethical standards are more robust?
Not sure, because food and impact of food you see immediately for yourself. Media literacy is more kind of a public good. I mean, it does not generate immediate personal benefits that you can say healthy food generates, at least in
Really
the
though?
short
Because
and long
there's
term.
if we go back to what we're talking about, TikTok, for example, TikTok is so successful exactly because it delivers an immediate benefit, a dopamine hit. And it's so addictive exactly because it delivers this. We're not talking about
Yeah,
getting quality right. Yeah. So if you continue the food analogy, we consume bad food because we get exactly the same reaction from it.
exactly. But the negative impact that in the
Yeah.
mid and long term would arrive very often is something that people see, and they know that for their own benefit. for the benefit of their own health. You know,
Sure.
you can make this case and you can explain this to the children. I mean, it's a little bit more difficult to explain the benefit of I don't know, public choosing what is right and what is wrong online, and how this would immediately have an impact on your life. I would say this is something that we should do, but I'm just a little bit more cautious about the parallel to that.
Sure.
But I think this is precisely the problem. The problem is that we have a public good here. It's our common good, which is in danger, and we have to raise awareness, but that by every time you pass on a WhatsApp message without having verified where it's coming from, you a little bit destroy our democracy. This bridge, yeah, it sounds very, kind of a lot of pathos, yeah. But this is precisely what it's doing. And by the way, not just children. I mean, if I look at the generation of many of our parents and my parents and myself, how many times I get something and then I'm like, yo, why are you doing this? And how many people did you send it to? Did you verify this? Just Google, you know? So
Yeah.
it's easy to do. But the understanding that this has not just, oh, I'm sorry, I just, okay, it's wrong, it's false. Sorry, happens. Well, this already is a step towards eroding trust into information, and this is how we should be pushing for it and having this literacy not just at schools, but also far beyond that, with public ads, with explanation. So kind of it's another enlightenment project that we're facing here. Unfortunately, the EU is not the one where we have competences on education. But from a political perspective, we have to do this, of course.
Thank you. Sophia, during the Second World War, Britain in particular and the United States had signs which said, careless talk costs lives. It was basically a public education campaign about being careful what you say and being careful what you share. Is that still a relevant motto for Europeans today? And if we focus a little bit on the Eastern European countries as well, how do we help fund projects which increase our sensitivity to quality media and to disinformation?
Well, I think every citizen can always have a certain responsibility to think before they act, and to improve their media literacy, as is the case. In the European Union, there are obligations to promote the media literacy of citizens of all ages. But on the topic of different projects, we do have actually a couple of interesting ones in place, funded by the European Union, that benefit either indirectly or directly Eastern Partnership countries. One of them being a project called EU for Independent Media, which receives around 8 million euros of funding to raise the abundance of fact-based quality media content, including investigative journalism, particularly in the Eastern Neighbourhood countries, helping with training, also with journalists on exile in an online format, and with different investments in technologies. And another one I could mention briefly is the Media Freedom Rapid Response project, which also benefits candidate countries, which includes Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine at the moment. And here, this project includes a website where there can be different alerts concerning media freedom issues flagged, which can be displayed in an interactive way and explored. I can recommend you to have a look if you have a chance. And it also encompasses different fact-finding, advocacy, monitoring, and awareness-raising activities that could help to bring violations of the press to the forefront and help journalists and citizens with necessary skills.
Thank you. Paolo, you wanted to add a little bit of media literacy, and Katie, I want to ask you about Georgia in particular.
Yeah, on media literacy, because your question was interesting, I think the dopamine effect. I think that here we have to be distinguished between media as a tool and media as content. So as a tool, indeed, there is a dopamine effect. On content, not at all. So we just scroll because we need to be in there, but the content isn't really creating this dopamine effect. The other point is that there is a word that we haven't mentioned so far, which is emotions. And the social media and the disinformers, especially, they play with our emotions, with our negative emotions. And COVID was mentioned earlier. During COVID, we were all scared or frustrated and so on. And all of us were irrational online. So it's true that the citizens, they have some rights, but it's also true that when it's about, irrational elements, then it's a little difficult to actually behave properly online. And there is tons of science actually proving this. Also, science proving that even when you know that content is false, you share it because you want to belong to the community you are in. And so maybe we should also reflect on the price to be out of this because the price is too high. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that media literacy is a lifelong learning process, and that's probably the main difference with health, which is still a lifelong learn process, but less, because technology is evolving so much that when I hear about media literacy only with schools, I get a little nervous, because why don't we implement media literacy initiatives in workspaces, for example, or in institutions that welcome elderly people? I mean, this is it's about a right of everybody, and we should all be equipped to deal with such an evolving landscape. So I think this is really important. It was rightly said that the EU has no competence on education, and indeed in the EU, I think only Finland has media literacy as curricular activity. But I think it would be somehow interesting and important that all countries adopt the same approach, because we all know that when we are in schools, if we are graded on something, we pay more attention and we focus more than when we are not graded. And this is the situation in most member states. So it's just a few hours, sometimes somewhere put in there. So there's almost zero interest by the youngsters. And finally, just to confirm what I was saying, how easy this all is, also on the disinformer side, a few weeks ago, I did a simulation exercise with some master students, and I asked them to build conspiracy theories, and to other students to actually build, if you want, a counter-resilience strategy. So building conspiracy theories was made way funnier than the other part. It was really easier. They came up with something which was so funny, but unfortunately so realistic, while the counterpart on like building resilience, on strategic communication and so on, was just boring. So this shows how reality is, unfortunately. So we have a hard job here, because we have to make something which is not so funny and not so easy become something that actually has an impact.
Thank you. I think you touched a number of really interesting points there. There's a book by a former Democrat strategist called Drew Weston called The Political Brain, and he talks specifically about the effect of negative messaging as well. Being 10 times faster and more effective, and costs 10 times more to reverse it as well. So negative messaging works. I wonder whether we can negative message on the disinformation side in reverse as well. Katie, let's talk about Georgia for a second. Your experience dealing with a turbulent election campaign, and the messaging as one thing, but just reporting accurately in terms of quality journalism and the ethical standards that most journalists would ascribe to. Is that difficult in Georgia, or is it simply that the market space doesn't permit that information to flow as you might expect or want?
Thank you so much for asking this. Georgian market is slightly different. I was listening to the European Union member states, and overall situation is very different here in Georgia. And let me let you see how it is. So the majority of Georgian media, the traditional and the online media, rely on ads, and I'm excluding the state-funded broadcaster in this case. And the ads, the income from the ads are mostly going to the TV channels, who we can kind of divide between pro-government and critical to the government. And then we're left with online media, who can provide independent reporting. But this is where resources come in, and this is when they do not have enough resources and enough staff or enough technical equipment to be able to report as much as the other kinds of media is able to. So the environment in that case is still plural, but all the government critical and independent voices face threats coming from or green lighted by the governments and the related institutions. I specifically mentioned state institutions in the beginning of my conversation. This is something that many countries in the European Union take for granted, or they just have it guaranteed that there's a rule of law and there are the state institutions that can come, check what's happening and act upon it. But for years, Georgia has been experiencing attacks on not just financial deficiency, but attacks on journalists that have not been investigated. And adding to that, there are specific regulatory institutions that are used as a punitive mechanisms against certain TV channels and online medias. And TV channels, I would say. And this is something that kind of summarizes the fragility and the complexity of the situation we have in Georgia. That first, independent journalism is it's still possible, but it heavily relies on Western funding, something that is being not just only threatened by the foreign agents laws and other laws that have been introduced despite a huge resistance in Georgia, but also stigma that they're trying to stick to the journalists and civic society organizations for trying to support Georgian democracy and to be able to have healthy democratic processes, which is right now at stake as never in a very long time in Georgia.
And that's part of the problem, isn't it? If the European Union is seen to invest in supporting a pro-democracy approach, then it's seen as a foreign agent, and it's classed as propaganda in its own right as well.
And the typical setting, sorry, I wanted to mention one more really important thing. The typical setting that the EU is looking at the whole environment is that there are some malign powers spreading disinformation in the country. But in Georgia, what we face is that the government is the power itself who is mirroring Russian propaganda, something that we have been talking about for a long time. I've also reported on this with Euractiv, something that many countries cannot even imagine dealing with, because those institutions should be the ones fight against it, but then they enforce this propaganda against civic society and overall its people to manage the narrative they need or they want to have for certain political interests and agenda.
Thank you. Just for our audience, if you want to send some questions, we'll do one more short round of questions, so please send those in now. Sergey, this is part of the problem, isn't it, that we're dealing with state actors, and those states are within the European Union, and those actors are perhaps the Prime Minister of a member state providing disinformation, whether it be Russian disinformation or others, direct to the public. That's very difficult to challenge, and they know it. So how do we manage these kind of threats within the democracy as well? It does seem increasingly naive to just say, well, they have the right to say what they want, and we have the right to lie. We can't. The first thing in law school is, if you talk about libel and you talk about free speech, you can't shout fire in the cinema. It's such an obvious thing. Why do we permit this from foreign leaders, which goes largely unchecked as well? Why do we permit it from European leaders and it goes largely unchecked as well? How do we approach this? I know it's a difficult question, but if you had the right to add something to the European Media Freedom Act or another instrument, what would you do?
That Orban should not be elected anymore. That we ban him from electoral processes. Yeah, no, I'm joking. I think the one thing is again to stand against this. And when Orban went to meet with Putin, and when Orban went to congratulate the Georgian Dream government, there were people in the streets. I mean, in case of Putin, not, but in case of Georgia, and there were politicians who said very clearly, he is not going there in our name. So putting things right is the most important point. If they are lying, and having ability and having the spine to do so. And I think that this commission, or the past commission, did have this ability, and they did, including von der Leyen when she spoke in our parliament, into the face of Orban, saying this, what you're doing is wrong and false. And by the way, most other groups did the same, political groups. So this is number one. Number two, use all the mechanisms that we have on rule of law that have been developed during the past 5 years. And here I congratulate ourselves. Yes, not everything is perfect, and Article 7 procedure is still stuck. But we look at the way that we went from us not knowing whether the European Court of Justice would ever assume the power of speaking law in the area of rule of law, up to now, where we have in a number of cases against Poland, against Hungary, already jurisdiction which is established by the European Court of Justice, where we can cut money, and the Commission did so vis-à-vis those states. So the red lines are drawn there, but we cannot mitigate all the risks legislatively. And we have to do this politically, and from that perspective, supporting free media, my project of introducing European associations as European NGOs as a legal status, that would also help NGOs to feel more safe within European Union, supporting civil society instead of vilifying them. This is what we will have to do. This is a marathon and not a sprint, but we will have to run it.
Sophia, you confident that the marathon can be run, or will we get the legs cut from under us after 2 kilometers?
Well, I hope we will be able to continue and complete the run successfully. I think we have a lot of instruments now at our fingertips that can be hopefully taken out and used as necessary. Some already in force, and some still becoming applicable later on. So I'm quite positive that with the different instruments, as the Commission has been quite active over the past 5 years in the now ending mandate to add more tools to the toolbox, we'll be able to make sure that rules are there to stay, and also the continuous monitoring in the rule of law reporting and its media freedom and media pluralism section is a continuous check on how the developments are doing in the member states.
So, okay, some issues here in the United States. For example, Fox News for this election cycle required all its journalists and producers to do a media ethics course of sorts, which was a little surprising. But one of the reasons was because it lost the Dominion case, and it paid out a huge amount of money because of that as well. And they didn't want that to happen again. Now, this goes back to what I was saying about media as business earlier. If you don't go to the heart of the cash, you really don't get to the heart of the problem. Rudy Giuliani, as a political actor, found himself having to cash in his luxury items and his Manhattan apartment, and he still owes 150 million because of the lies that he told during the election process as well. So there's accountability to be had, and just back to what you said about the European Union having a spine as well. Do you think, given all the elements that Sophia has laid out, all these elements in place, is this a matter of political courage now, and Europe having the confidence to use the tools in place to drive a more positive narrative? Sergey?
It is a matter of courage. I think by now we are not naive anymore. All the people who did not understand what it is about now do say what it is about. I remember how 6 years, 10 years ago, we were talking about liberal democracy and the threat of liberal democracy, and everyone is like, "What are you talking about?" Now everyone is talking about this. So I think that the diagnosis is more or less clear. Now it is about actions. And one more thing that I think is important, and this is something that I repeat again and again, this is a competition not only between between authoritarians and liberal democracies in terms of which one is has less sins, but rather which one can deliver. Can we as democracies deliver? Can we deliver in Moldova as democracy, by the way? Can we deliver in Georgia? Can we deliver as EU also security guarantees to those countries who would say, yes, we want to be liberal democracies, but then Putin would bring the troops to our borders? Would you defend us, or would you leave us alone like Ukrainians and will give us the right weapons just 2 months before you leave us to Trump? This is what citizens are not stupid. They're watching, they're seeing, and if they see that democracies do not deliver in terms of their security, but also in terms of their welfare, they will go over to the dark side. And this is where we have to start acting, and we need to strengthen institutions, and we need to strengthen our courage as political actors. This will be the big fight of the upcoming 5 years.
Thank you. That's a point very well made. Paolo, just on this as well, in terms of disinformation, do we get disinformation fatigue where we simply say, look, I'm not interested, the government's not delivering what I want, inflation, immigration, whatever, why should I be prudent in my information anyway? Is there an element of fatigue in this?
Well, there is an element of fatigue the moment that actually the same narratives and the same content arrives, and that actually, so there is a kind of repetition, which is actually the strategy of disinformers. So the drop after the drop. What usually is not there is fatigue when when the disinformation content touches on something that is very close to citizens. So, for example, and now I'm going on the other way around, but when it's about climate change, most of the researchers say stop talking about polar bears to someone who lives in Sicily because it's too far for this person to understand. And so basically it's easier actually for these informers to come up with their points because basically it's something that doesn't touch them. While if you tell them, listen, you're stopping to, I don't know, have oranges as your agricultural output, but avocados, this is something that, of course, in Sicily they would get better. No? So to apply that on the other way around, the point is that the more actually content is attached to our life, the more it has an impact. And this brings me to something a little broader, which is, let's also be honest, the reason why disinformation has such a power is also because there is an overall, not only mistrust in institutions, in media, and so on, but overall also a social, political, and economical situation in which I would say a big percentage of the population is frustrated, is angry, is not living the life that they would expect, but also is actually, if you want, also below a certain minimum requirement for a dignitous life. And this is where actually the famous negative emotions I was mentioning earlier come into effect. So if you're happy with your life, you are not addicted to social media, and you are not actually so much influenced by disinformation. But if your life is not happy in the sense that you really feel let's be honest, we are all privileged people here, except Katie, who unfortunately is in a situation which is really dangerous. But we all have a certain level of education. We all have a certain standard of life. So we are privileged here, but there are people who are actually not in such a privileged position and that have really hard lives. And those people, they have emotions, and those exactly the target of these informers. They go and touch there. And let's then move it to the populist discourse, which is the elite against the population. This is precisely that. So it's like saying, you see, the elite is actually using you. Now, then, of course, if you try to show them Trump is part of the elite, Elon Musk is Trump of the elite, they wouldn't see that. But the point is precisely that. So to play on this element.
So if you're happy with your life and not addicted to social media, you don't have a problem. So we all have a problem. Okay, we have one final question, and then we're going to do the wrap up 30-second sound bites as well. So Katie, you want to take this? It's from Georgina Turner, and this is actually for you as well. So how is the constant vigilance required today different than in the past? How is the constant vigilance required today different than in the past? Katie?
Not sure what she means exactly.
Constant vigilance against misinformation, disinformation, and having to be an advocate for quality media, quality journalism.
Yep. Well, thanks for the question. This, at least in our environment, became something very actual as a problem in the past several years. And since I think Russia started war in Ukraine, the wave of Russian disinformation penetrated different environments and many countries that were not really targets as deeply before. And Georgia saw the waves of disinformation and misinformation very explicitly since that year. And the past 2 years, basically, we're watching waves of disinformation, basically trying to manage public discourse in Georgia. And this goes much beyond a disinformation that can just exist and manage people's opinions about vaccines, for example, but it actually touches upon very painful points that Georgians, for example, have, which is a war that Russia started in 2008. And the whole campaign that the Georgian Dream ruling party has been performing past 2 months was based on this, that this is what basically they are the guarantees of peace, and pro-democracy opposition in power would mean war in Georgia, and they were showing destroyed cities in Ukraine as something that would happen to Georgia if the pro-democracy parties were in power, something that went beyond anything, and it was extremely angering to Georgian people. Even the oligarch that rules the ruling party in Georgia mentioned that we have to apologize to Russia for the war that Russia started. So this is the scale of this disinformation and how rapidly it can actually develop into something more dangerous and affect different layers of society. And the emotions that Paula was talking about, those are really alarming. And this, I want to conclude this with the global power struggle between autocracies and democracies. And altogether, disinformation is major tool that we have to face, that autocratic regimes use against democracies and the countries that attempt to be democracies nowadays.
Thank you, Kitty. Let's do our 30-second wrap up, and then we'll close. Sophia, off to you. 30 seconds, just your closing message.
All right. So now we do have tools, particularly with the European Media Freedom Act, to improve editorial independence and safeguard it in Europe. It's time to put it into play. It's one of the political priorities of the Commission to help to implement the rules that will soon become fully applicable. And let's hope that also the candidate countries later on, as they will need to adhere to the European standards, will also quickly adapt themselves to the new rules that will help us in this mission.
Thank you, Sergey.
I think what became clear is that we all have responsibility in this area, and this responsibility also is with members of this parliament, for example, that we do confront the right wing, which is overwhelmingly here now, which is trying to steer the debate and divert the debate from the issues that are really important and put it into a Trump-like polarized area. And this is something that we would need to confront as well, and of course strengthen the institutions and media people.
Thank you so much. Paula.
I would say we should never take democracy for granted. There is no democracy without the rule of law. There is no democracy without a healthy and empowering information ecosystem in full respect of fundamental rights.
Thank you, Paula. Katie, last word.
Well, the message from the eastern part of the European Union to the European Union member states: democracy, the global democracy is at risk, and this is something that is visible in Georgia. Silencing civic society, silencing media here means that this is gonna extend to other countries in the region, and eventually there are risks that within the European, this is already a problem. So this has to be taken seriously, as mentioned by other guests at this panel. The West needs to act now in order to defend democracy. globally.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panel, Sophia, Sergey, Paolo, and Katie. Also, thank you to our team in Brussels, Shifra, Pablo, and the social media team there as well. And as well, our thanks to our supporter today, European Media Information Fund. I'm Brian Maguire in Washington. I am, and I jest not, having lunch with Tucker Carlson's former producer today. Love your enemy, people. Have a good day.